Here are my 13 worst bosses in Dark Souls, and you'll definitely be surprised to see a few of them on the list. Number 13. We're going to kick things off with Ceaseless the Scaleless. Now, I'm very much on the fence about this fight for several reasons, and that's why it appears at this point in my rankings. The boss and arena are visually great. To encounter Ceaseless for the first time to then have a scripted death is also actually a really cool feature that almost turns everything you thought you knew about the game's bosses upside down. However, what I struggle with enjoyment-wise is the actual boss itself. I'm fine with the needing to destroy the primordial crystal in order to do any damage. That's a nice little puzzle added to the boss. But the fight itself feels extremely unfair if you try and tackle it by attacking and dodging, as you either just get walloped by the tails or get cursed by the crystals. Once you work out that all you need to do is actually just stick right up close to the join of its front tail and body, then it's just too easy. The boss either has too much challenge or none at all, and as one of the 4 main bosses that you need to defeat in order to reach the end of the game, it just feels like the fight should have a more epic moment to it. And it just doesn't. Number 12. The Taurus Demon is a fairly good early game boss. For my pathing, I always encounter this as my second boss, and for the early game, it properly builds on the knowledge that you learnt from the Asylum Demon. The ability to do a plunging attack to deal some hella damage, and then fighting toe to toe in a tighter, more constricted arena gives some epic moments for a new player. Plus, you have the first opportunity to utilise applying a gold pine resin imbuing your weapon with lightning damage, which the Taurus Demon is weak to. It is a very fun little fight and extremely intimidating on that first playthrough. However, when all is said and done, there is nothing of any real challenge to this boss. His moves are far too easy to dodge, and effectively you can just spam the plunging attack to take him out. At least with the Asylum Demon, you only got one shot at doing that attack. Number 11. The optional boss On Gwindel is a very visually pleasing boss fight. The never-ending corridor, eerie music and constant ranged attacks look really cool. However, from a gameplay perspective, it is extremely repetitive. Run towards the boss, dodge attack, then attack, wait for the boss to reappear, and repeat. I really like the idea of the never-ending corridor, but I feel like it may have added more jeopardy if we were the ones being chased by the boss down a never-ending corridor instead of the other way around. It just feels very slow and doesn't get the blood pumping. Number 10. The Centipede Demon is actually a pretty interesting fight. While the attacks leave much to be desired, being surrounded by a burning pool of lava doesn't leave you much room to dodge, and you could very easily end up being swiped into the inferno. The Centipede Demon also has a mechanic whereby if you chop off its tail or limbs, they will then scurry around the arena trying to kill you too. So for me, this fight was a fun little challenge of managing both my environment and also ensuring I attacked the correct part of the boss so as not to create more enemies, but with such a low health pool, the fight just feels like it's over before it's even begun. And due to the environment, you are forced to just repeat the tactic of hit and dodge, and I would love more of an opportunity to take on this enemy in a more accessible arena. Number 9. As one of the OG Lords, Gravelord Nito should be an epic battle of miasma versus metal, but unfortunately, while visually the boss design is cool and grim, the difficulty of this boss is not the boss itself, but the minions that surround him. That being said, once you make the realisation that if you just focus on Nito, he will then unintentionally swipe away his minions. And as with Ceaseless, for one of the game's 4 main bosses, this battle really should be epic, and it isn't, at all. Number 8. Okay, so here's to the OG and not so one and only Asylum Demon. Now, objectively, for a first boss, this guy is fantastic. The impending doom when you first enter the arena when it jumps down, for you to then be able to scurry off and revisit it a little bit later on. Then, to start the fight proper with a plunging attack from above really gives you a sense of, oh damn, maybe I can actually do this, is a great feeling for a brand new player. So, while this is a great boss for a tutorial first playthrough, on subsequent runs it just falls flat. A few firebombs and Bob's your uncle. What really doesn't help, which is no fault of the Asylum Demon, is that this boss is then reskinned 2 more times later in the game, taking away from any uniqueness it may have had. Number 7. Talking of reskins, the Demon Fire Sage is one of 2 reskins of the Asylum Demon, and to be honest, it just feels a little lazy. What makes this boss more difficult than both its predecessors though, is the arena. Being in a tight corridor with broken branches strewn about the place can get you in a bit of a pickle, but other than that, I literally have nothing else to add on this one. It's a whole big pile of meh. Number 6. Initially, the Stray Demon is a nice callback to the first boss that we face in the game, the Asylum Demon. And for anyone not paying attention when you first start the game, it's a pretty fun surprise when you do return to the Undead Asylum and fall through the floor. However, other than a nice callback to the start of the game, for me it literally adds no value in my playthrough. It does have some additional moves, a higher HP and does more damage than the OG, but that's it. Number 5. The Moonlight Butterfly visually is one of my favourite bosses. The elegance, the music is just beautiful. And while this is an early game boss, I feel it's just far too easy and doesn't really pose much of a threat to the player. One thing I recently learnt for another video I made is that the Moonlight Butterfly is actually regenerating its health every time it lands. And in my mind, I really wonder why didn't they make the regen rate even higher? It would have turned what is an extremely tame boss into a decent endurance fight that could teach new players patience in a game that very much so requires it. Number 4. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Ceaseless Discharge has by far the weirdest names of any Dark Souls boss, and I have absolutely no idea what drove From Software to do this. But moving on, this boss with a standard melee strat is intense, and was possibly my most challenging boss of my first playthrough. Trying to dodge and time the swooping attacks so that they wouldn't clip through the stairs or floor and still hit me was one of the longest strats I've ever attempted on any boss. I then gave up after finding a much easier strat to just hit and run the tentacle attack down the narrow passage. But obviously, I now know that there is a far easier way to do this boss fight, and well, it again relegates what was a challenging boss into the realms of one of the worst bosses in the game. Number 3. Firstly, I will say this, I love puzzles, and I really love puzzle bosses. But Bed of Chaos just completely misses the mark for me. For what visually looks like an absolute banger of a boss is relegated to 3 hits to be defeated. Personally, I would have loved it if they'd kept the boss as is, but then made an additional final phase where we fight the boss in a 1v1 of melee madness, just like the Dark Souls mod by King Bora. This would have been so epic to see in the game. And again, another of the 4 main game bosses to just feel like a wet noodle is a real disappointment. Number 2. For me, the Catacombs were the worst area in Dark Souls. My initial playthrough was fraught with death after death, which wasn't helped by the lack of bonfires that I discovered. So you may think that finally reaching the end of such a horrible place to be greeted by possibly the easiest boss in the game would put a smile on my face. But no, it didn't. It felt more like a slap in the face that I went through all of that hardship to be met by such an easy to kill boss. I really wish they had just tweaked the health and damage of the Pinwheel clones, and this could have been a really tricky boss fight, maybe one to rival 4 Kings. Granted though, you do obtain the Rite of Kindling by defeating Pinwheel, but whether you fight this boss early or late in the game, it just leaves me feeling deflated. Number 1. And finally, going in my dead last spot as the worst boss in Dark Souls is the Capras Demon. Now, we all have a bit of disdain for this guy that inhabits the lower undead burg, and for me, this fight just isn't fun in any way, shape or form. I remember on my first playthrough, I would enter the gate and just get mauled by the doggos again and again, and when I did manage to panic roll past them, I met a swift end by the Capras machete. This fight goes from being a tight battle to the death on an initial playthrough, to just cheesable on subsequent runs. Whether that being standing on the water wheel and performing the plunging attacks, or throwing firebombs over the fog gate. It just doesn't have any positive going for it. Literally the only good thing this boss has going for it is... oh wait, nothing. And that's it. There is my rundown of the worst bosses in Dark Souls. But more importantly, what are your thoughts on the Dark Souls bosses? Which boss do you think has huge potential but just completely misses the mark of what makes a Dark Souls boss epic? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and as always, make sure you like and subscribe for more Dark Souls content.